Welcome to Fascist Economics 101.
Welcome. Thank you for stopping by. This episode is largely made to explain and flesh out what I outlined in Episode 1, the Framework of Fascist Economics. If you haven't already listened to it, I defined a lot of terms in it and refer to it constantly, so this episode won't make a lot of sense unless you've listened to the Framework episode. So today, we'll go into the sources and historical examples behind the framework and prove each part of the argument out. Now, I understand that the Framework episode contradicts a lot of people's understanding of fascism. That's because pretty much all of the academic literature about fascism is wildly contradictory. In terms of ideology alone, there are many scholars who have mapped out lists of things that characterize fascist ideology. There are other scholars who insist that there is no such thing as fascist ideology. There were fascists who produced works on the beliefs of fascism, but most sources of fascist philosophy had limited contact with actual fascist governments or leaders in the first place. And that's just ideology. In terms of economics, the neo-Marxists dismiss fascism as a mutated form of capitalism. The leading advocate of the existence of fascist economics, David Baker, tentatively argues that fascist economics is just a narrow ideology about improving employment. And neoliberal economists don't regard fascism as having any particular stance because none of the decisions of major fascist governments, from the neoliberal point of view, seem to have been acting on any kind of coherent economic policy. Even the basic facts of the economic history are up in the air. Historian William Shirer became convinced that the Nazi economy was simply a war economy from beginning to end, a view that has since informed many people's opinions on fascist economics. But historian Arthur Schweitzer then pointed out that this isn't reflected in any of the actual economic documents, and that the Nazi Party barely involved itself with military policy until 1936. As a result of all this, if you're going to have any opinion at all about fascism, fascist ideology, or fascist economics, you're going to have to play defense, because no matter what you believe, more than half of the scholars out there will swear up and down that you're wrong. And you'll also have to play offense, because you'll need to explain why everyone with a contradictory opinion is wrong too. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Coming at this from the standpoint of selectorate theory, which I alluded to in the Framework episode, there is a way to reconcile a lot of the difficulty and disagreement in this field. First of all, we need to talk about something called the fascist minimum. For this, I want to give full credit for this idea to Nope Brigade on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. They are an activist and PhD candidate, and I greatly admire their work. If you aren't already familiar with them, please check them out. They're terrific. Again, their online handle is Nope Brigade. I'll link to them in the description for this episode. There are basically two approaches to describing what fascism is. Approach number one is where you take a grab bag of fascist societies, and every author picks different societies, by the way, and you make a Venn diagram, and you declare that whatever's in the middle, the commonalities between those societies, must be fascism. The result of this process are the dozens of books and list articles, listicles, about the 14 characteristics of fascism, the 12 early warning signs of fascism, the 10 characteristics that define fascism, and the 13 early warning signs of fascism. All of those titles that I just listed are actual books and articles, and like all good listicles, you better believe that number 4 will surprise you. This approach, which Nope Brigade describes as listicle fascism, fails for a wide variety of reasons, but the central issue is that we in political science have a data problem. There just haven't been enough large-scale fascist societies for us to say anything really conclusive about fascism. In statistics, you generally don't even want to run the math until you get at least 20 or 30 data points. But we have political scientists who should know better, drawing conclusions from comparisons between just two fascist societies. In statistics, the reason why making big conclusions off of very few data points can be a problem is that you end up paying too much attention to surface-level differences that don't matter, and that's exactly what happens here. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany were products of their time. Both of them were newly unified nations. Germany was only unified in 1871 after the US Civil War, and Mussolini came to power after Italy had basically a medium-intensity civil war of its own. In these time periods, Italy and Germany were desperate to solidify their national identities and oppose communism, which was a major destabilizing force in Europe at the time. So, whenever scholars take these two societies and do the Venn diagram thing, guess what? They conclude that fascism is basically equal to nationalism plus anti-communism. It's the most surface-level interpretation possible, and you can't extend it to any other society. Now, the Venn diagram approach is approach number 1. The antidote to all this is approach number 2, which Nope Brigade describes as the search for the fascist minimum. The idea is that if you spend all your time on Venn diagrams with too little data, any new fascist society will fail in some way to meet the criteria even though it's fascist. So instead, it's better to spend your time finding the absolute minimum requirements that a society needs to be considered fascist. The approaches that work best for this tend to dig very deeply into the world of political psychology, at thoroughly investigating what lies at the center of a fascist mindset. That's why I can say what I outlined in my framework video, that fascism fundamentally is the ideology of the bully. Nope Brigade currently has a video about the fascist ideological minimum pinned as the first video of their TikTok page, and I really recommend checking it out. Now, Nope Brigade and I don't have a complete overlap of opinions. They consider Umberto Eco's work to be approach number 1, whereas I consider at least his work on Ur-Fascism to fall under approach number 2, but if Nope Brigade and I agreed on everything, there'd be nothing for us to talk about, so what fun is that? All that said, I'd like to swing this conversation over to economics, which is what I find really interesting. Now, in line with how Nope Brigade approaches fascist ideology, I'd like to discuss finding the fascist economic minimum, the minimum requirements for what qualifies as fascist economics. For us to find the fascist economic minimum, it isn't enough for us to Venn diagram different fascist societies. Instead, we need to drill down into what makes fascist economics tick. This gets us to the structural aspect of fascism, which I outlined in my framework episode. For us to identify what about fascist economics is special, we first have to identify what about it is different. For that, we have to look at fascist economics comparatively relative to other forms of authoritarian government. A major benefit of this approach is that instead of having the comparison be, for example, between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, in which case you're only looking at two societies, we can take those two societies and hold them up against hundreds of different historical examples of authoritarian societies. As a result, the conclusions we can come to are much more grounded since we're using more data. As I was reading up on Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, I noticed that these countries really don't follow what I call the pure authoritarian playbook that I described in the framework episode. This was the first thing that clued me into the fact that there is something fundamentally different about how fascist economics works relative to other forms of authoritarianism. So, what's normal for authoritarian societies? What are we comparing everything against? Well, to identify the main hallmarks, of authoritarian societies, I look at them using selectorate theory. Selectorate theory is a kind of perspective on political economics that was pioneered by game theorists. A core idea of game theory is that to an extent you can understand someone by understanding their motives. That is, once you see what someone cares about and what's important to them, you'll notice that their actions usually follow. Selectorate theory extends that perspective to political analysis. In authoritarian governments, the ruler's motive is to stay in power, and there is a pattern to how authoritarian leaders typically accomplish this. Now, I'm going to read two short sections from The Dictator's Handbook by Dr. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith. Pardon the gimmicky name. The Dictator's Handbook is the consumer-friendly version of a dense game theory text, and the way they made it consumer-friendly is by writing it as though it was advice for a wannabe dictator, but obviously it's a lot more than that. I'll link it in the description along with a great YouTube video by CPG Gray that introduces the basic concepts of selectorate theory. Anyway, think about this next part in the context of what I call pure authoritarianism in the Framework episode. These sections are part of a list of rules that wannabe authoritarians should follow. Quote, Rule 3. Control the flow of revenue. It's always better for a ruler to determine who eats than it is to have a larger pie from which the people can feed themselves. The most effective cash flow for leaders is one that makes lots of people poor and redistributes money to keep select people, their supporters, wealthy. Bravo to Pakistan's President Asif Ali Zardari, estimated to be worth up to $4 billion even as he governs a country near the world's bottom in per capita income. End quote. So, in the pure authoritarian model, where a country is flooded with diamonds or oil that government businesses are extracting, wealth goes directly from the ground into the government. This isn't taxation where you get your revenue from the citizens, so your revenue doesn't depend on your citizens being productive and wealthy. Your citizens can be poor, and it won't affect your revenue in the slightest. Instead, your revenue is collected through government-controlled businesses. It's a pure transfer of wealth. That's why I call it pure authoritarianism. Here's another part of that section. Quote, Rule 5. Don't take money out of your supporters' pockets to make the people's lives better. The flip side of Rule 4, which is to pay your supporters just enough to keep them loyal, is not to be too cheap toward your coalition of supporters. If you're good to the people at the expense of your coalition, it won't be long until your friends will be gunning for you. Effective policy for the masses doesn't necessarily produce loyalty among essentials, and it's darn expensive to boot. Hungry people are not likely to have the energy to overthrow you, so don't worry about them. Disappointed coalition members, in contrast, can defect, leaving you in deep trouble. Bravo to Senior General Than Shwe of Myanmar, who made sure, following the 2008 Nargis cyclone, that food relief was controlled and sold on the black market by his military supporters rather than letting aid go to the people. At least 138,000, and maybe as many as 500,000 of whom died in the disaster. End quote. So let's think about this quote in the context of pure authoritarianism. It means that national wealth is the enemy. If you enrich your country by any measure, you're empowering the people to revolt, and you're limiting your allies' reasons to keep you around. That's why making the nation poor is an inherent economic policy goal of pure authoritarian leaders. Now, the phenomenon of high-value commodities like diamonds and oil leading to a country being poor is called the resource curse. Authoritarianism is the primary culprit, but there are other parts to this. Right off the bat, these resources wouldn't be so high value if wealthy countries didn't place such a high value on them. In the past, European colonizers set up authoritarian systems deliberately, deputizing locals who could keep the rest of the population in line while extracting resources for the sole benefit of the colonizer. It was the British who put the Baathists in charge of Iraq. That's how we got Saddam Hussein and Iraq's current mess of ethnic tensions. But that was then, during the colonial period. Now, in the age of capitalism, the high prices for diamonds and oil have led business people in search of any market that would supply them. This has presented wannabe authoritarians with a golden opportunity. The pure authoritarian model works because there are international buyers who are willing to look the other way so long as the oil and diamonds keep coming out of the ground. Our oil has been paid for in blood. In the interest of completeness, there is another reason for the resource curse, and it's really important, but it's boring, so I'll be brief. There's a phenomenon involving inflation called Dutch disease. It was named after that time in the 1630s that the Dutch decided that flowers were the coolest thing ever in an incident called the tulip bubble. The problem is that if one part of the economy does way better than another part of the economy, prices in the country will inflate. This inflation won't really hurt the part of the economy that's doing well, but all of the other parts of the economy are really going to suffer from that inflation. So, if a country has a high-value commodity like diamonds or oil, the inflation that those sectors almost always cause will hurt every other area of the economy. This doesn't even have to happen in an authoritarian context. This is just a general economic phenomenon. So this thing, Dutch disease, is also part of the resource curse. Anyway, in terms of how to use these ideas, use pure authoritarianism as a model against which you can measure how close or far different kinds of societies are. Now, right off the bat, there are obvious differences between the pure authoritarian model and historical fascist societies. Most importantly, in fascist societies, the wealth of the nation was generally maintained. In both Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, their economies actually grew during their fascist periods. Now, this isn't a clean narrative. Both countries had to deal with the Great Depression in 1929, and Nazi Germany was barreling towards a financial crisis in the lead-up to its invasion of Poland in 1939. As another wrinkle, there definitely was unethical wealth transfer like you would find in a pure authoritarian society. In Nazi Germany, there was a massive and systematic transfer of Jewish wealth into the hands of racial Germans. Please keep in mind, the Jewish people weren't just killed, they were robbed. According to one of the authorities on the subject, Albrecht Ritschl, dispossession of Germany's Jewish population ranged from private robbery and pogroms to state-sponsored theft, and that Germany in the 1930s taxed its Jewish minority out of existence. Additionally, once the Germans moved the Jews to concentration camps, the Jews no longer had possession of their homes. What happened to those homes? Well, they were distributed to non-Jewish Germans. As Ritschl stated, dispossession was extreme and complete. However, this is a far cry from pure authoritarian societies, where everyone, regardless of race, would be impoverished to shield the wealth of a few. So, given the fact that fascism doesn't operate the way that pure authoritarianism does, we need to uncover why. The reason will guide us towards the fascist economic minimum. To do this, let's look at what would happen if you implemented a pure authoritarian model in a Western capitalist country. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to say that phrase over and over like I did in the last episode. I went back and counted, and I said the phrase Western capitalist country 18 times in the Framework episode. I'm very sorry for doing that. I know it's repetitive, but I swear I had a good reason. The deal with that phrase is that I'm trying to express a very big, complicated idea in a compact way. I know it has a lot of problems. First of all, what's Western? Is all of Europe Western or just parts of it? West of what? And what countries do we consider capitalist in a world where every society mixes and matches their economic policies? If you think the United States doesn't have a single socialist law, that just means that you don't know what laws we have. And furthermore, why can't what I'm saying about Western capitalist countries apply to countries elsewhere in the world? It's not like political science stops at a national border somewhere. The reason for this hideously contrived phrase is I'm trying to appeal to an idea of a kind of country just so we have a common understanding. I'm talking about a place like France, like Germany, like England, places with strong market economies, but not much in the way of things like diamonds or oil. But everything I'm saying absolutely applies to other places in the world like Costa Rica and Japan. Okay, back to what I was saying. We need to examine what would happen if you implement pure authoritarianism in a Western capitalist country. Just to make it fair, so no one says we're cherry-picking the data, I decided to use the Czech Republic for this example, since it has the 2025 estimated median GDP per capita in Europe. So it's a fairly typical example of the kind of country we want to examine. Granted, it could be described as socialist by some standards, but there's no such thing as a pure capitalist country anyway, so the distinction doesn't really matter for this purpose. According to Wikipedia, the industrial sector accounts for 37% of the Czech economy, while services account for 61% and agriculture for 2%. According to worldstopexports.com, if you add up the Czech Republic's top 10 exports, those categories come out to $191.9 billion, starting with electrical machinery and equipment. Okay, now let's pretend we're implementing the pure form of authoritarianism. That list of the top 10 exports, get rid of almost all of that. To simulate what a pure authoritarian government would do, we want to eliminate everything except for natural resources that can go into the government with zero processing in between. After all, processing requires things like factories, which provide things like jobs and livelihoods. And if we're talking about pure authoritarian societies, we don't tolerate that. So, of that list of the Czech Republic's top 10 exports, the only items left are articles of iron or steel for $8.2 billion, mineral fuels including oil for $5 billion, and separately, iron or steel for $4.9 billion. These add up to $15.1 billion, which is 7.9% of the original top 10 export figure of $191.9 billion. 7.9%. In other words, a transition to a pure authoritarian model would sacrifice about 92% of the top exports, let alone the destruction it would wreak on the domestic economy. So, what does this tell us about the pure authoritarian model? It means that if your goal is to become wealthy and powerful as an authoritarian leader, it won't work very well if you're starting with a Western capitalist economy. Because step one is to destroy 91% of the money you want for yourself in the first place. So when wannabe authoritarians look at a Western capitalist country, they say to themselves, I want to gain money and power by ruling this place with an iron fist, but the pure authoritarian playbook would have me grubbing for pennies on the dollar. There has to be a way to transition to authoritarianism without burning the economy down. This insight is what gets us to the first part of the fascist economic minimum. Because as it turns out, there's an easy way to avoid burning the economy down. In fact, job number one that fascist economics is trying to do is basically to just not burn down the pre-existing economic system. Let's get into it. The fascist economic minimum is that there are two jobs that fascist economics is trying to do. Job number one, maintain the features of capitalist economics. Now, this role gets left out of most comparative views of fascism because fascist leaders didn't do anything obvious to radically transform their economies. So it's easy to mistake this as just not making a decision. The reason we know that preserving many capitalist institutions was deliberate is because the fascists made extensive use of the trappings of capitalism, such as private property and the existence of corporations, in job number two, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, the neo-Marxists are probably fairly happy with this assessment, but I lose them in the next section, and I'll get to that in a bit too. This brings us to job number two of fascist economics: dominate all economic activity under the state. This second half of the fascist economic minimum is a direct extension of job number one. Pure authoritarians don't have an economy to manage because they engage in the systematic destruction of the economy. So if you are an authoritarian government and you've already decided to keep the economy intact, now you have to do something with it. And if you're authoritarian, as per the advice of the Dictator's Handbook that I quoted earlier, you're going to want to control as much of it as possible. That means that the state shall reign supreme in the economic arena, and it uses a wide variety of tactics to achieve this, including tariffs and various forms of regulation. This is the point where I lose the neoliberal economists. This goal, dominating economic activity under the state, isn't what neoliberal economists are trained to recognize as economic policy. This just looks like a political preference, an unfortunate ill of authoritarianism, not a deliberate principle of economic policy making. But in a fascist political context, that's exactly what it is. The desire to dominate all economic activity under the state is the political and ideological goal that drives fascist economic policy making. Leaders in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy said directly and repeatedly that their economic decisions were guided by their political realities. We should believe them. Now, I know that the Framework episode was a bit vague as to what this looks like, so let me give some concrete examples. For context, for this first example, if you want to import or export anything to people in other countries, and if the people in those countries use something other than the US dollar, you need to exchange currencies at some point, and this process is called foreign exchange. Now, in September 1934, German Minister of Economics, Hjalmar Schacht, introduced his new plan for the economy. It had 4 parts. Part 3 is the interesting one. As Arthur Schweitzer wrote in Big Business in the Third Reich, quote, "The foreign exchange offices retained exclusive authority over the final receipts and payments of foreign exchange. The granting of rights to use foreign exchange was the joint function of these offices and the newly established supervisory boards of the state. The code numbers of these permits had to be attached to the freight papers of all foreign goods entering Germany, and customs officers were instructed to prevent the import of any other goods." End quote. In other words, the ability to import and export was regulated by the Nazi government's control over foreign exchange. They didn't allow just anyone to import or export. You needed the government's permission. This is how the Nazi government took control over this aspect of the economy. By the way, the restriction on imports meant that the average German basically stopped having access to citrus fruits for a few years, and consumer products started to be made out of lower quality materials. Let's take a look at another example of Nazi domination of the economy. a German corporation law that was accepted by the government in January 1937. This one's interesting. I want to focus on two changes that this law made. The first change was that shareholders in a company were no longer allowed to decide corporate policy. Second, managers were only allowed to be paid bonuses if the company made what they called voluntary social contributions, and the only real options throughout Germany were Nazi social organizations. Think about the combination of these two changes. The shareholders can't decide company policy. That means that the managers get to decide policy. And the managers will only get their bonuses if the company contributes to Nazi social organizations. What do you think happened? Basically, all German companies started contributing to Nazi social organizations, which came to dominate German social life because they had all the money in the world. This corporate change was one of the most transformative features of German social life, a major political win for the Nazi Party since the social organizations engaged in political indoctrination, and it came at the expense of the ability for investors to guide the companies they invest in, totally anti-capitalist. A smaller example from Nazi Germany is that eventually there was just large-scale corporate cooperation with the Nazi Party. As Schweitzer wrote, quote, "Most employers cooperated with the party by giving preference to old fighters, that means World War I veterans, when hiring additional workers, by paying extra wages to workers who participated in indoctrination meetings or camps, and by dismissing workers who refused to respect the Nazi flag or declined to become workers of the Labor Front, a Nazi organization. Workers were dismissed without notice if they failed to raise their right arms in a Heil Hitler greeting on the appropriate occasions." End quote. Now, in a capitalist framework, companies would generally want to hire and keep the most productive workers regardless of political ideology, so long as they weren't explicitly anti-capitalist. But here, businesses effectively surrendered their authority over some of their own decisions to the Nazi Party. This mechanism of corporations following Nazi social policy helped the Nazis dominate economic activity. For an Italian example, let's look at Mussolini's April 1927 labor charter, spread by the Grand Council of Fascism, love that name, and published in the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia. This document created government-organized unions for every sector of the economy and said that they were the only organizations the government would negotiate with, that they had the right to form binding agreements with all employees in their sectors, and that they had the power to levy union dues on all workers in their categories. These organizations exhausted all resources necessary to create any independent unions. And naturally, these groups were controlled by fascist party members. These unions are examples of what in political science are called GONGOs, government-organized non-governmental organizations, GONGOs, GONGOs. Almost always, GONGOs outwardly appear to be independent while actually serving government interests. More importantly, this mechanism of mandatory GONGO unions was powerful. It put the fascist party on the opposite side of the negotiating table from every company in Italy. If a company was on the good side of the fascist government, negotiations could go smoothly. If a company was on the bad side of the fascist government, negotiations would not go well. This placed enormous pressure on Italian companies to bend the knee to fascist initiatives. And obviously, GONGO unions were in complete control of labor, because this was the only venue through which workers were legally allowed to negotiate with company management. Additionally, Section 23 of this law about employment bureaus states, employers are required to hire workers with precedence given to those registered in the party and in fascist trade unions. Guaranteeing employment for fascists is a great way to ensure that fascists are present at every company, diluting the ability of any company to take a coherent anti-fascist stance, if any of them worked up the nerve. So I just listed a few examples. The Nazi control over foreign exchange, the Nazi corporation law, the Italian labor charter. But did you notice what these things had in common? They're boring. They're bureaucratic, and that's why they worked. These changes didn't seem like a big deal. They didn't grab big flashy headlines, but they worked to overhaul their societies and break down resistance to fascist ideology. The bureaucratized nature of these changes disguised their effects. It's insidious. Job number 2, dominating all economic activity under the state, goes directly against everything that makes capitalism capitalism. Capitalism is all about removing limits and restrictions on economic activity. It's sometimes called hands-off economics. Generally speaking, any law, any restriction on what a company can do is anti-capitalist. To limit how companies and individuals can act and to impose taxes, tariffs, and regulations on companies for political purposes is completely anti-capitalist. Now, the neo-Marxists who have written about this believe that fascism is a mutated form of capitalism, but they're wrong because they're overlooking job number 2, the domination of all economic activity under the state. Neo-Marxists are largely uninterested in making distinctions between economies that have markets because in their eyes, market economies are the enemy. One of the common denominators of communist theory is that free markets are engines of inequality. To neo-Marxists, there's no point in making a detailed map of market economies because they're all bad. But job number 2 flies in the face of the most basic principles of capitalist economic theory. Additionally, the neo-Marxist position that fascism is just a militarized form of capitalism is not historically correct. In Nazi Germany, the upper classes spent most of their time fighting against the Nazi Party in economic negotiations. I'll address this specifically in a future episode about the economic history of Nazi Germany. And the fact that the United States is adopting these policies shows how far the transition already is from a capitalist economy to a fascist economy. All right, so that's how I came to the fascist economic minimum being 2 jobs: the maintenance of capitalist systems and the domination of the economy under the state. Thank you so much for listening. I realize that this was more academic than the Framework episode, but I hope I've made it interesting and I hope you found some worthwhile takeaways. Please share this podcast with anyone who might be interested, and please share these ideas with the people around you. The more people who are aware of fascism as an economic construct, the more ways we can find to oppose fascist power.